welcome to the show.
Hey, Rob.
Thanks for being here, Dave. Dave, I thought we would start. I've done a lot of research on you, and you've got a pretty fascinating background. And so I was hoping that you could maybe share with the listeners on the podcast two things. One is your background, and then two is, how did you get started in doing supply chain investments?
Sure. Background is 50 years, more than 50 years in the supply chain business, which is a long time and does date me here, doesn't it? Makes me an OG, which I thought when you first said I was going to be an OG, I thought it was old guy. So,
Original gangster.
Yeah, I know. Now I know. But I spent 35 years as a global IT supply chain strategy consultant, retired from Accenture 2001, and has been since then. And about 6 months after it, my wife asked me, "What are you going to do with the rest of your life? You know, you're still pretty young." And that was good, 20 plus years ago now. And I said, "Well, I'm going to be a venture capitalist." So, years later, and I did develop a good network in the VC community when I was at Accenture. Made some good investments there with our we had a fund, a partner fund called Accenture Technology Ventures, and made some money for my partners as well, and said, "Gee, I'm pretty good at this." And then I said, "I'm going to do this in my next iteration in life." And so, here we are, many years later, and been chastened in many cases by investors who were going to be brilliant and didn't, and also done pretty well in a lot of other of our investments.
Well, let's talk about that. Maybe just to play off that last comment. Maybe talk about one of your biggest successes. I know I can think of one for sure, but you probably had lots of them. And then maybe think about something that didn't go so well, and maybe some insight as to why you think that investment didn't turn out as planned.
Sure. I think it's hard to pick a huge winner. I mean, one of our first winners was Kiva Robotics, which sold for $700 million to Amazon.
Wow!
Years ago, and that we were very early stage in there with Bain Capital, and that obviously went very well. And then a more typical one, which does reflect on how we operate today. We're more of a hybrid fund. We do early and late stage deals. So the LlamaSoft, which we were very early investors in, Don Hicks' company, and about 6 years ago, private equity guys approached us, TPG, and said, "Hey, what are you going to do with that thing? It's almost $100 million in revenue. It's sitting in your portfolio." And I go, "Aren't you going to let it go one of these days, Dave?" And I said, "Well, make me an offer." And so we stayed in. We left our money in, and which we do when private equity does buy our companies. And we continue to work on M&A and stuff like that with the company and hiring and what have you. And so that sold a few months ago. Well, actually now over a year ago. That sold to Coupa Software, and for many billions. So
that's with a B.
Yeah, that was a real big success, and so. But we've had our failures as well. One I'll talk about is a company that we actually took over. Myself, my partner, and of all people, Don Hicks, who was the founder of LlamaSoft.
Huh.
We were all investors in a company that was called Supply AI, and it was doing returns logistics management for retailers. We liked it a lot. And because you had this proliferation of retailers, a lot of your customers, I might add, Rob, that were buying stuff from China, and then getting it to the customer, and then the customer didn't like it, and they were saying, "I don't want this thing," and call up the retailer and say, "What are you going to do for me? What are you going to do? How are you going to?" And the retailers often had no ability to really manage returns other than to say, "I'll send you a shipping label," which of course you lose the revenue from the company. So let's just say there was a problem with the founder. I won't go into detail. Who now is not welcome back in the United States, and the other VCs who were invested in it they wanted to shut the company down, and we said we like that company, and so now we own it, and
Interesting.
we're investing in it for the last year, and it's doing extremely well. I won't say it's because of us; it's because of the good CEO we hired. But that's a success story out of a big failure.
Rescued from the ashes.
Yeah, right. Others.
Well, it says a lot about your commitment, Dave, all the way
Yeah.
through. You stayed with it, and in fact, you bought the company. So
Others we find a good home for, Rob. We just say we found a good home. Acquired by so and so. Doesn't say you gave it away, but yeah.
That's a polite way to say it. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of which, Dave, so I would, just to your point, we refer to you as the OG. What are the biggest changes you've seen in the 20 years that you've been investing in supply chain? Particularly, you can maybe talk about the last 4 years, but over the course of 20 years, what are you seeing that's different now than was different when you started, or that was in existence when you started?
Sure. Well, I think this is something everybody's experiencing, and I call it the demise of linear supply chains. and I think everybody grew up in the era, and unless you were born a few years ago, grown up in the era of when a supplier sent materials to a manufacturer. The manufacturer made it, put it in its warehouse, then shipped it to maybe a retailer, who then shipped it to a store, in which a consumer came in and bought the product. Amazing, right? That was the way this supply chains existed for centuries.
Yeah.
And over the last 5 or 6 years, the whole world of omnichannel has really blown up that model. And I don't care whether you're a manufacturer, a supplier, a retailer, a store, you're all faced with omni-channel challenges, because what we've moved into is a world of what I call ship anything from anywhere, right? And
yeah,
it's like, okay, instead of getting that product, just like Mercado, instead of getting that product from a store, I go online and I had this retailer selling it, and that retailer ships it to me from some far off place, right?
Sure.
It's cool, right? Great. First mile logistics, and all, and plus the last mile logistics. But omnichannel has really created havoc in supply chain execution and planning, because most of the tools things I screwed in when I was at Accenture, iTunes, and logistics, SAP, APO, they really can't handle omni-channel distribution very well. They were all designed for the linear supply chain model. So that's become, I think, the big challenge we have today, which turns out to be a bonanza for investors like myself, who can invest in companies that are starting to look at how do I better do omni-channel, perhaps with preserving the existing legacy systems, because those systems of record are really important to the CFO in the company, saying, I need to know my inventory, I need to know my freight costs, and I don't want to rip all that stuff out. But my logistics guys are saying, I've got 10 more channels to manage, and how do I decide replenishment strategies and inventory strategies in those channels, which is actually the course actually the class I'm teaching at MIT on Friday is exactly on that subject. Is multi-channel replenishment inventory strategies. So yeah, we're moving into a new world here. It's not getting any simpler, and anybody coming into the supply chain at this point in their lives definitely going to face those challenges.
Which leaves me, I've got two more questions. I'm going to ask the first one first. You talked about the supply chain used to be linear, and now it's omnichannel. How about investing? Do you think that the supply chain investment community is so hot right now because of the omnichannel? Or there's another reason that supply chain investing is no longer linear. It's also going up quickly. What do you think is contributing to the maybe possibly irrational exuberance in supply chain?
Well, yeah, I lived through the one in 2000 where all those marketplaces. Don't
bring that up.
Yeah, right. Whoops.
Oops. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, no, I think today, what you're starting to see is the disruption getting funded, and you have sort of these two very large groups. You have the Tigers of the world and the SoftBanks and the Vistas that have multi-billion-dollar funds that will pick certain winners and I'll pick on Flexport, which has got $2 billion invested in it, digital broker, and that's great. I mean, SoftBank put $1 billion in, and Andreessen Horowitz just put another $1 billion in. And that's one level of investing in this space, and there's more and more of those starting to appear. GoPuff. Let's just pick on another.
It's crazy
delivery guy, right? They I think their revenue's 2 or 3 billion a year, and their EBITDA is minus 500 million. Real great model there. Yeah. Anyway. But then there's guys like us who are smaller. We're more the finders and minders in the world.
Finders and minders.
We do both places now. We do, and First Mile, came into our. We do a lot of e-commerce logistics, and then you showed up, Rob, and we said, "Damn, no one's paying attention to this First Mile," and getting it out of foreign countries and getting it through customs and brokerage and carriers to move it, and that's a lot of stuff to do, a lot of stuff to manage, so that's an example, I think, for how we look at the early stages. We're looking for areas that haven't been touched historically, but are starting to emerge, and may have a lot of logistics issues that no technology to really deal with them yet.
Dave, that's a great segue. Sarah Barnes Humphrey just asked a question about, are you seeing a particular kind of tech that's getting more excitement from VCs? So you talked about maybe untapped spaces that need to be disrupted. In addition to that, is a particular type of technology. You mentioned robotics earlier in your conversation, and I would imagine AI is something you guys look at, and machine learning and the whole thing. What kind of technology gets you excited, Dave, in this space?
Well, we're looking for disruptors in spaces today that are like visibility. And, great. P44, 4Kites, great companies. We were invested in MacroPoint, which we sold to Descartes. But we also think that the new world of visibility is not going to be, accumulating a lot of data from the carrier and shipper world and creating a visibility platform. It's going to be sensors, and so we've done a couple of sensor investments recently, which we think are a big time and important. I'll give a plug for one, TIVE, TIVE.
Yeah, they're doing great.
Yeah, they're doing really well. They just raised an awful lot of money. I can't tell you the number yet, but anyway, and we're actually playing a bit in blockchain. We do think that if you're going to get in the risk, resilience, sustainability space, you've got to have an underlying technology that's going to allow you to, trace back that supplier, to the farm or wherever, the palm plantation, and so that becomes another another area that we're hot on. A third is autonomous vehicles. We have investment in a company that's doing yard management, autonomous yard management vehicles, and also over the road, which we think is going to be critical to dealing with driver shortages and things of that nature going forward, and making life happier for a driver who doesn't have to, go through 18 gears every time he wants to do something.
Yeah, I think autonomy and electrification, I agree that those are two hot areas. Well, Dave, unfortunately, I could talk to you all day, all week, but our time here has come to an end. That went actually, we've got a few more minutes. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my clock wrong. I have 4 more minutes. Okay, so I have one more important question for you, Dave, before we depart. When you think about the next generation of people coming into supply chain, and you were talking to somebody who was maybe just out of college or a young person looking to enter the industry, what advice would you give them?
We're dealing with this with one of my partner's sons right now, who majored in supply chain, and he really wanted to join supply chain ventures. He was like, I want to be a VC. Yeah. And we said to him, what? You should really need to go out and get some experience, right? You need some experience. I never had a lot of operational experience. Mine was in IT and strategy, but my partner Dan ran big warehousing and fleet operations for large companies. And if you want to be in, I think it's important to get bottom line experience in transportation and warehousing. If you want to be anything else in supply chain, I don't care whether you want to be a chief supply chain officer someday, you want to be an investor, you want to found your own supply chain startup, please, spend a couple of years in like the Pepsi organization, running Fritos, Southwest facilities, and doing C-store level replenishment stuff, which is really pretty exotic things to do, and do something like that, where you get a real feel of what it's like to work with real people in that environment, so that when you want to be an investor or a founder, you understand that it isn't all about software. It isn't all about raising money. A lot of it's about your knowledge of the space and being able to do it. And truthfully, I get a lot of young people that come to me, with startup ideas, especially in digital freight networks. They come, they say, Dave, we're going to revolutionize freight brokerage. And, and I say, do you ever work in the business? Say, tell me how many transactions, how many steps there are in a typical freight transaction. They have no idea.
Yeah.
I say, well, I'm just going to throw a number out. I say, probably minimum 18. From when you tender the freight to when you pay the carrier. I mean,
that's
there's
right.
18 steps. And if you don't understand all that, how are you going to build a network, a platform to digitize it? Oh, well, we know all about technology. Well, congratulations, and even I'll even go back to Flexport and say, if you look carefully, Flexport still has a lot of people in the back room with a phone on each ear. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well said. And Dave, thanks for that. I think that's great advice. It's interesting for me to see the supply chain having gone from something nobody even knew existed to suddenly becoming a hot space that people actually wanted to enter into the profession. So I loved your approach. Learn it first, and then maybe see if you can innovate it. So last question, Dave, before we were live here, you talked a little bit about the fact that there's clearly some dark clouds coming ahead. And I just didn't know if you wanted to touch on that at the end a little bit here in terms of what you're sort of forecasting, given all the events in the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in my last segment, but just love to get your perspective, Dave, on how you think people should respond right now, given the fact that there may be some dark clouds on the horizon.
Right. Well, thanks. Thanks for pressing us all here. Well, I have to teach another class at MIT after this podcast, and it originally was on supply chain financing, And I got a call from the professor and said, the kids all want to talk about, how bad Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine is relative to COVID for supply chains. And, could you spend some time on, on that as part of what you're going to do today?
Yeah.
And it's, I haven't, we all still have the shovels out there digging into supply chains to see, what the impacts are going to be. But, you start to talk about raw materials like lithium and purified neon gas, right? And palladium, all come out of they're the leading producers of those are Ukraine and Russia, and it's and because purified neon gas and palladium are used extensively in semiconductors. So the impacts we saw in COVID. One of my stories today is going to be they may be chump change compared to what these next impacts are going to be on global supply chains. Things we saw in COVID are going to be accelerated even more with more shortages, and I think we're going to have a real recession as opposed to one we created ourselves as a result of a lot of this. So I'm not hopeful, but I'm also trying to. I'm trying to keep a positive attitude and donate money to Ukrainian relief to help all those millions of refugees. Please, everybody.
And Dave, I'm gonna pray to a quick end to this conflict on that note. So, Dave, thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate you and all that you do, and hope the audience really enjoyed getting to listen to you as well. And good luck with your students at MIT. Sounds like fun.
Yeah, right. Cheers, guys.